Next time we shall meet again in our old place. Did you hear me?
Is that yes or no?
No.
No?
I see. All right.
All right. I'll try.
Next time we shall meet again in Social Science 122. Did you hear me? Very good. We are discussing now the position called historicism. You can say there were two forms of it, a primary or naive historicism and a radical historicism. The latter being started by Nietzsche. The primitive or primary or naive historicism asserts a historian is a spectator of the historical process who sees that all principles of thought and action come into being and perish. But he exempts himself, his principles of thought and action. He stands on the banks of the river, not in the river. The radical historicist asserts that this is impossible, that there is no place outside of the stream. The consequence is that the pride of the naive historian in historical objectivity proves to be unfounded. All knowledge is relative to the historical situation, and this applies to the historian's knowledge as well. There is no objectivity, or what we call objectivity is only a derivative mode of a certain kind of subjectivity. Now, I have begun to try to explain historicism somewhat better, in greater detail, by beginning to speak of Collingwood. I limited myself to the autobiography, but in the meantime I thought I should say something about his idea of history, his larger work. This is simplified by the fact that many years ago I wrote a long review article on it, and I will quote from that a few passages. Now, what Collingwood tried to do is to develop what he calls the philosophy of history. Philosophy of history, as he understands it, necessarily entails a complete philosophy conceived from an historical point of view. For the discovery on which philosophy of history is based concerns the character of all human thought and not merely of historical thought. It leads therefore to an entirely new understanding of philosophy. In other words, it was always admitted that the central theme of philosophy is the question of what man is, and that history is a knowledge of what men have done. But now it has been realized that man is what he can do, and the only clue to what man can do is what he has done. Therefore, the so-called science of human nature or of the human mind resolves itself into history. Philosophy of history is identical with philosophy as such, which has become radically historical. Philosophy as a separate discipline is liquidated by being converted into history. These are very extreme, but therefore clarifying formulae. One can say historicism is characterized by the fact that the traditional and to common sense so obvious distinction between philosophy and history, between philosophic and historical questions, is abandoned. A fusion of philosophy and history, a complete fusion, is intended. Now, whether that is feasible remains to be seen. Now, Collingwood, the question consists of two parts. Why is history necessarily philosophic? And why is philosophy necessarily historical? To the first question, why is history necessarily philosophic? Collingwood answers, all history is history of thought. By which he means this: let us take something so seemingly unphilosophic as the Battle of Trafalgar. But what does it mean to understand the Battle of Trafalgar? Collingwood asks. To understand the thought of Nelson, to understand his human thought. Wherever, in every historical investigation, even in archaeology, which was archaeology of Roman Britain, which was Collingwood's special interest, when he tries to understand the meaning of fortification, what does it mean? What is his fortification for? I.e., what was the thought of the builders? This is a partial explanation why history is necessarily philosophic, since it is understanding of human thought. Another conclusion: since all thinking is critical thinking, and not a mere surrender to the object of thought, rethinking of earlier thought is identical with criticism of earlier thought. The point of view from which the scientific historian criticizes the past is that of the present, of his civilization. Scientific history is the effort to see the human past in its entirety, as it appears from the standpoint of the present of the historian's civilization. That's to say, history is self-knowledge, and what is more philosophic than the attempt to know oneself? Yet, history will not be self-knowledge. If the historian sees the past in the light of the present of his civilization, without making that present his primary theme, he must know what the present of the civilization is in order to understand it. The scientific historian's task is therefore to show how the present of his civilization, or the mind of the present day, or that determinate human nature which is his civilization, has come into existence. Philosophy being fundamentally self-knowledge, because what does it mean to raise the question of what is man? This is not feasible, according to Collingwood, except through history. The consequence of this is that all history and or philosophy is relative to the present. Now, how can this be justified? Now, an analysis would show that two premises are involved. In the first place, an assumption of the superiority of the present. The point of view of the present is the highest point of view that ever existed, and therefore we don't lose anything by looking at the past from the point of view of the present. The second point of view, however, which differs from it, the second reason, however, which differs from it, is the equality of all ages. I read to you. Augustine looked at Roman history from the point of view of an early Christian, and Gibbon did so from that of an enlightened 18th century Englishman. There is no point in asking which was the right point of view. Each was the only possible for the man who adopted it. Correspondingly, the present-day historian who looks at the past from the present-day point of view cannot help looking at the past from the present point of view. And in this decisive respect, all ages are equal. There is here a difficulty. If the insight into the equality of all ages is the decisive insight, then our age is nevertheless superior to all other ages, because only our age has that insight. It is clear. I stated it as follows. The belief in the equality of all ages is only a more subtle form of the belief in progress. The alleged insight into the equality of all ages, which is said to make possible passionate interest in the thought of the different ages, necessarily conceives of itself as a progress beyond all earlier thought. Every earlier age erroneously absolutized the standpoint from which it looked at things, and therefore was incapable of taking very seriously the thought of other ages. Hence, earlier ages were incapable of scientific history. Now, in his idea of history, Collingwood gives us a specimen of his own historical work, in the form, because he writes a history of historical understanding throughout the ages. And what one can say of that history is only that it is extremely poor as a historical work. Collingwood simply does not take seriously, say, Thucydides or Tacitus or Herodotus. And one can understand that, because he is so certain of the progress made by 19th, 20th century scientific history. Hence, we draw this conclusion. In order to take the thought of the past seriously, as he wishes to do, one must doubt the superiority of present-day thought. Otherwise, you do not have an incentive for taking seriously as the thought of the past. History, in other words, is required not simply for the sake of self-knowledge, but also and above all for the sake of self-criticism, not only to find out what that Plato and Aristotle, for example, contributed their mite or their share to that beautiful and complete wisdom which we possess, but also we have forgotten many things which Plato and Aristotle knew, and this is at least as important a function of the historian to recover that loss. Only a few more points which I wish to make in this connection. Now, if this is so, if it is necessary for understanding ourselves and for understanding our limitations, to understand the thought of the past, it follows indeed that a fusion of philosophy and history is inevitable. And to that extent I would agree with Collingwood. There is a simple indirect proof. When you look at present-day literature on political and social matters, one observes the shallowness of those present-day thinkers who lack a historical perspective. It is obviously necessary for us to have this historical perspective, and to that extent it is simply true that a fusion of philosophy and history is inevitable. But we must not deceive ourselves about the crucial implication of this seemingly trivial point. In our age, the fusion of philosophy and history is necessary, as everyone will see if he begins to think about any question, whether it's democracy or sovereignty and so on. When he wants to have clarity, he has to engage in historical studies. Mostly people do not engage in historical studies, but look up the next encyclopedia or dictionary and get their facts, as they say, from there, which are in all cases then, of course, simply very secondary, not to say tertiary, results and reflections of what some historians, perhaps good ones, have found out. The mere fact that such a fusion is today practically inevitable implies a radical break with traditional philosophy in which such a fusion was inconceivable. Now one could say, and that is a common view, that this is a progress beyond traditional philosophy. Traditional philosophy lacked that peculiar reflectiveness which we have and which induces us to engage in historical studies. But this phenomenon can also be viewed from a very different point of view. Let us take the example of Thomas Aquinas. His thought, political thought, was based to a considerable extent on Aristotle. So he had studied Aristotle. He had him at his elbow, we may say. But this was not historical study. Aristotle was the philosopher, the authority in these matters. The basis of his thought, we can say, was contemporary with Thomas Aquinas. Whether he read Aristotle in Greek or Latin is very unimportant here. But we in our age are in that situation that the bases of our thought are not contemporary with us. And the reason for that is the fact and the notion of progress. Certain crucial decisions were made, say, in the 17th century. This was continued. An enormous structure arose. We are high up in that structure, but we are not directly confronted with the foundations. We have to the way of progress, we can say, is this. Ever higher and higher. But this implies blindness about the foundations if this process is not accompanied by an inverse process, the digging up and the understanding of the hidden foundations. So while we modern men are, by virtue of this quote, progress unquote, are in need of historical studies in order to see again the hidden foundations of our thought. This is not so in all ages. In other words, the fact that we need this fusion of philosophy and history does not mean by itself that our thought is superior to that of the past, in which such a fusion was not necessary and not even possible. Now I return to Collingwood's autobiography. I have read to you a few passages in which Collingwood indicates his starting point, namely a revision of logic, a substitution of the logic of question and answers for the propositional logic of the past. And I have indicated how this change in logic, the insight into the primacy of question, is connected with his historicism. Now I will continue this. This autobiography is a very spirited book. He was a fighting man, obviously, and the men whom he fought were a school who called themselves, quote, realists, unquote. Let us see what these people say and what's about, because the word realism has infinitely many meanings. Cook Wilson By the way, a man well known in Platonic studies, he is one of these realists, asserted knowing makes no difference to what is known. In other words, this piece of furniture is wholly indifferent to my knowing it. This behind me, the blackboard, is the same blackboard whether I view it or not. And the simple proof is that if I turn around, I know I will see. Knowing makes no difference what is known. And a commonsensical view, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a true view. Collingwood regarded this assertion as meaningless. I argued that anyone who claimed, as Cook Wilson did, to be sure of this, was in effect claiming to know what he was simultaneously defining as unknown. For if you know that no difference is made to a thing theta by the presence or absence of a certain condition C, you know what theta is like with C, and also what theta is like without C, and on comparing the two, find no difference. This involves knowing what theta is like without C. In the present case, knowing what you define as the unknown. Is this clear what the argument means? When you say knowing makes no difference to what is known, you imply that you know the thing in its status of not knownness. And this is absurd. By knowing it, you always know it is known. This is the simple refutation of realism. And this has, of course, most crucial implications, because the view which Collingwood ascribes to these men in Oxford is the view of the whole pre-modern tradition, the view expressed in the definition of truth as the adequation of the intellect and the thing. My thoughts are true if what is in my mind, say, about this piece of furniture, agrees with the thing, the piece of furniture itself, and that all imperfection of knowledge are those in which my thoughts do not reflect, do not reproduce the character of the thing. So to think truly means to think what is, to look at what is. Knowledge is fundamentally receptive, in spite of all non-receptive, spontaneous activities which might be required in a subsidiary fashion. Now, what do we say to Collingwood's argument? I would put it this way, I don't believe it settles the issue. Precisely if it is impossible to say whether truth stems from the human mind or not, because that is of course what Collingwood implies. Since we cannot possibly know the thing as it is outside of all relations to the human mind, the truth originates ultimately in the human mind. Now, precisely if it's impossible to say that, one must leave the question open. We find, every one of us finds, even in the greatest disturbances, which may be imagined, an order. Cats are not dogs. Trees are not brutes. Stones are not trees, and all these things behave in a peculiar manner, to say nothing of man and the various differences among men. The key question is this: does this order, this taxis, originate in the human mind, or does man, in the process of learning and knowing, awaken to a taxis, to an order which is independent of man? This indifferently stated, the latter view is identical with the view that man is a microcosm, that man is a being privileged by nature to understand, or to be open at least, to all things, whereas brutes are incapable of that. Whereas the other view is that man, there is no such privilegedness of man by nature, but man, a being among all kinds of being, is the only one capable to produce an intelligible order. Now, Collingwood contends, and this is by no means so clear, but that the view that nothing is affected by being known leads to consequences both regarding human action and regarding political theory in particular. Now, he speaks there of certain developments in Oxford at that time, after the First World War, which run parallel to things with which we now are very familiar. I mean, and which is now known in England as various philosophies, analysis of language. It was not yet called that way at that time, but Lord Russell played a great role already at that time, and he is a great living link between that Illuvian era and our age. I read to you just a passage for illustration. Moral philosophy from the days of Socrates down to our own lifetime had been regarded as an attempt to think out more clearly the issues involved in conduct for the sake of acting better. In 1912, one of these men announced that moral philosophy, as so understood, was based on a mistake, and advocated a new kind of moral philosophy, purely theoretical, in which the workings of the moral consciousness should be scientifically studied as if they were the movements of the planets, and no attempt made to interfere with them. And Bertrand Russell at Cambridge proposed in the same spirit, and on grounds whose difference was only superficial, the exclusion of ethics from the body of philosophy. Well, this has of course happened in the meantime. Only what is called ethics has no longer to do with ethics. It's no longer a normative discipline, but it's merely an analysis of ethical language. The realist philosophers who adopted this new program were all or nearly all teachers of young men and young women. Their pupils, with habits and characters yet unformed, stood on the threshold of life. Many of them on the threshold of public life. Half a century earlier, young people in that position had been told that by thinking about what they were doing or were about to do, they would become likely on the whole to do it better, and that some understanding of the nature of moral or political action, some attempt to formulate ideas and principles, was an indispensable condition of engaging creditably in these activities themselves. The realist said to his pupils, if it interests you to study this, do so, but don't think it will be of any use to you. Remember the great principle of realism, that nothing is affected by being known. That is as true of human action as of anything else. Moral philosophy is only the theory of moral action. It cannot therefore make any difference to the praxis of moral action. Now, whether this follows truly from the principle of realism, I have my doubt, because Aristotle was a realist in that sense, and he was, and Plato too, and yet they had no doubt that knowledge does make a great difference regarding action, although it does not affect things which cannot possibly be affected by human action, like the course of the planets, to take a simple example. Now, I read to you, the same happened, of course, also to political theory, that it lost all its use and reasonableness. we come to a more interesting and more immediate problem, to which I have alluded yesterday, or the last time rather. It was another, the realists who were in these matters old-fashioned people, however strange this may sound in the case of Russell. They took, for example, for granted the distinction between philosophy and history, and denied that there is a fusion between them possible or necessary. The realists thought that the problems with which philosophy is concerned were unchanging. This is a point which I read to you this last time, which Collingwood questions radically. And was it really true, I asked myself, that the problems of philosophy were, even in the loosest sense of that word, eternal? Was it really true that different philosophies were different attempts to answer the same questions? I soon discovered that it was not true. It was merely a vulgar error, consequent on a kind of historical myopia, which, deceived by superficial resemblances, failed to detect profound differences. And now here there comes a passage which I read to you about the people who say Plato and the Republic and Hobbes' Leviathan deal with the same subject, the nature of the state. And he wonders, how can you translate polis, the subject with which Plato is concerned, by state? And there is, of course, something very important implied. There is, of course, a connection between these two things, between the thing about which Plato speaks and the thing about which Hobbes speaks. But it is not the kind of connection that the realists thought it was. Anybody would admit that Plato's Republic and Hobbes' Leviathan are about two things which are in one way the same thing and in another way different. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is a kind of sameness and a kind of difference. The realists thought that the sameness was the sameness of a universal, let us say, commonwealth. And the difference between two instances of that universal. The commonwealth understood as polis, the commonwealth understood as a modern state. But this is not so. The sameness is the sameness of an historical process. And the difference is the difference between one thing which in the course of that process has turned into something else and the other thing into which it has turned. Plato's polis and Hobbes' absolutist state are related by a traceable historical process whereby one has turned into another. Anyone who ignores that process denies the difference between them and argues that where Plato's political theory contradicts Hobbes, one of them must be wrong, is saying the thing that is not. The Swiftian formula for a lie, for an untruth. Good. Now, here, of course, here we come reach a point where Collingwood's thesis ceases to be clear, where he's compelled to admit that there is no contradiction between Plato's doctrine and Hobbes' doctrine, because they answer entirely different questions. As if it were not possible to raise a question, whose question is a more profound one? I mean, maybe that given the Hoppian question, it could not be answered in Plato's manner. I gladly grant that. But the question concerns then the rank, the order of rank of the question. Here Collingwood stops. He gives here another example. It was not difficult to see that just as the Greek polis could not be legitimately translated by the modern word state, which I think is true, except with a warning that the two things are in various essential ways different, and a statement of what these differences are. So in ethics, a Greek word like dei cannot be legitimately translated by using the word ought, if that word ought carries with it the notion of what is sometimes called moral obligation. Was there any Greek word or phrase to express that notion, namely of moral obligation? The realists said there was, but they stultified themselves by adding that the theories of moral obligation expounded by Greek writers differed from modern theories such as Kant about the same thing. How did they know that the Greek and the Kantian theories were about the same thing? Oh, because they, or whatever word it was, is the Greek for ought. In other words, this Greek word, which has a primary meaning, something is lacking, is needing. Of course, does not in itself mean ought, but in certain connections it can approach that meaning. But the fundamental point which he makes, you have no right to assume that an earlier thinker, an earlier great thinker, must have dealt with what you regard as a fundamental question. Is, of course, simple common sense. Well, I do not. It's not necessary, I think, to do it. I read you the conclusion. Ideals of personal conduct are just as impermanent as ideals of social organization. Not only that, but what is meant by calling them ideals is subject to the same change. Of course. I mean, try to translate the word ideal into classical Greek. You wouldn't succeed. There is an equivalent for it, or a half equivalent, but that shows a great difference. Something for which you would wish or pray. That would be the equivalent to some extent of what we mean by an ideal. But it is, surely there is no connection, as I might mention in passing, between ideal as a word has developed in modern, since the 17th century, and the Platonic idea. There is a connection of sorts. Without the Platonic concept of idea, people had never come to speak of ideals, but these are very different things. The realists knew that different peoples, and the same peoples at different times, held different views, and we are quite entitled to hold different views about how a man ought to behave. But they thought that the phrase ought to behave had a meaning which was one, unchanging, and eternal. They were wrong. The literature of European moral philosophy from the Greeks onwards was in their hands and on their shelves to tell them so. But they evaded the lesson by systematically mistranslating the passages from which they might have learned it. And here he alludes, Collingwood alludes to a very well-known fact, I think it should be well-known, that we are the slaves of the translators. And the translators are in most cases men of an impossible innocence in these matters. They are not aware of what they are doing by translating an important word by the most convenient equivalent in present-day, everyday usage. That's impossible. And that is the reason why it is necessary, if for one reason or other one wants to see the truth about this matter, to learn at least as much of these languages that one can check with the help of dictionaries the work of the translators. Now, we come now to the core of Collingwood's teaching. Traditionally, the central discipline of philosophy was metaphysics. What happened to metaphysics on the basis of the insight into the historicity of all human thought? It became clear to me that metaphysics, as its very name might show, after physics. So people still use the word as if it had been paraphysics by the side of physics, or like parapsychology, is no futile attempt at knowing what lies beyond the limits of experience, but is primarily at any given time an attempt to discover what the people of that time believe about the world's general nature. Such beliefs being the prepositions of all their physics, that's to say, their inquiries into its detail. Secondarily, it is an attempt to discover the corresponding presuppositions of other peoples and other times, and to follow the historical process by which one set of presuppositions has turned into another. In other words, the central and highest philosophical discipline, metaphysics, is nothing but the understanding of our fundamental presupposition, seeing it together with other cultures or other people's fundamental presuppositions, and the movement from one set of presuppositions to another. And this is indeed a radical statement. Collingwood calls these presuppositions, to make it quite clear, the absolute presupposition. The question of what presuppositions underlie the physics or natural science of a certain people at a certain time is as purely historical a question as what kind of clothes they wear. In other words, it is not in any peculiar sense philosophic. And this is a question that metaphysicians have to answer. It is not their business to raise a further question, whether among the various beliefs on this subject that various peoples hold and have held, this one or that one is true, whether the Babylonian or Greek or Hebrew absolute presupposition is true or untrue. This question, when raised, would always be found, as it always has been found, unanswerable. And if there is anything in my logic of question and answer that is not to be wondered at, for the beliefs whose history the metaphysician has to study are not answers to questions, which therefore can be criticized, are they correct answers to the question or not, but only presuppositions of questions. And therefore the distinction between what is true and what is false does not apply to them, but only the distinction between what is presupposed and what is not presupposed. The beliefs which a metaphysician tries to study and codify are presuppositions of the questions asked by natural scientists, but are not answers to any questions at all. This might be expressed by calling them absolute presupposition. Now this is of course a crucial point. All human thought rests ultimately on absolute presuppositions, which differ from historical epoch to historical epoch, and regarding which the question of truth or untruth cannot be raised. This does not lead by itself to relativism and nihilism, that is what Collingwood implies, because we cannot help believing in the absolute presuppositions of our society. And therefore, practically the question doesn't arise. But the great question is whether there are not grave crises in cultures or societies where the absolute presuppositions become questionable. And there, of course, there is no way out thinkable. Collingwood has no doubt that this state of affairs affects the possibility of historical objectivity regarding the absolute presuppositions. In other words, since all historical thought is also human thought, therefore dependent on absolute presuppositions differing from historical situation to historical situation. Therefore, historical thought is open to the same difficulty that it cannot have objectivity proper. We look at the absolute presuppositions, say, of Plato or Hobbes, from the point of view of our absolute presuppositions. The only objective knowledge of a philosophic character is that of the series of absolute presuppositions which we discern in history. Of course, I cannot be in ethics or political theory proper, for they depend on questionable absolute presuppositions. Now let me pursue that. If this, from all I have said before, it follows that a rapprochement between philosophy and history is absolutely indispensable in Collingwood's view. A new kind of philosophy. A new kind of philosophy. Now what is it? Soon after the beginning of the century, a number of intelligent people in Western Europe began to see in a settled and steady manner, in the 17th century, what a few here and there had seen by fits and starts for the last 100 years and more. Namely, that the problems which ever since the time of early Greek philosophy had gone by the collective name of physics were capable of being restated in a shape in which, with a double weapon of experiment and mathematics, one could now solve them, whereas hitherto they had been insoluble. What was called nature, they saw, had henceforth no secrets from man, only riddles which he had learned the trick of answering. Or more accurately, nature was no longer a sphinx asking man riddles. It was man that did the asking. And nature, now that he put to the torture until she gave him the answer to his questions. Now this grave change, this great progress made in the 17th century is a model for that new great change which Collingwood plans to help to bring about. This statement about modern physics as the revolution of the 17th century clearly implies that the absolute presuppositions underlying modern physics are superior to the absolute presuppositions underlying Greek physics. And therefore this contradicts flatly the statement of the equality of the absolute presuppositions, or in other words, that the question of truth cannot arise regarding the absolute presuppositions. Now, something analogous to what Bacon and Descartes and Galileo did regarding nature must now be done in regard to history. Why is it that is very urgent? Why? It seemed almost as if man's power to control nature had been increasing pari passu with a decrease in his power to control human affairs. In other words, the well-known facts, the complete chaos, moral chaos, which has arisen in modern times, and the Collingwood expects that the new philosophy, i.e. a philosophy which is radically historical, will solve this problem created by the increase in man's power through modern physics and technology. The usual view is, well, we only have to develop scientific psychology. They will take care of the problems caused by modern physics and chemistry by enabling us to manipulate men better, so that they behave more reasonably, and so on. And Collingwood has very sensible things to say about this point. Psychology cannot do the job. He states it in very general but clear terms. Psychology deals with the soul in contradistinction to the mind. And since the question of true and untrue, good and bad, are questions for the mind, psychology is incompetent to deal with them. That is very abstractly stated, but I think fundamentally sound. But the question is whether history can do the job, an intelligent or philosophic history, which psychology admittedly cannot do. Was it possible that men should come to a better understanding of human affairs by studying history? Was history the thing which in future might play a part in civilized life, analogous to that of natural science in the past? The historian is a person whose questions are about the past. He is generally supposed to be a person whose questions are exclusively about the past. About a past, namely, that is dead and gone, and no sense at all living on into the present. This view Collingwood denies. The past which an historian studies is not a dead past, but a past which in some sense is still living in the present. Therefore, the historian alone can help us in understanding the present having the past within itself. So long as the past and the present are outside one another, knowledge of the past is not of much use in the problems of the present. But if the case is radically different from the other point of view, he gives this example. Nothing here but trees and grass, thinks the traveler and marches on. Look, says the woodsman, the trained man, there's a tiger in that grass. The historian's business is to reveal the less obvious features, hidden from a careless eye in the present situation. What history can bring to moral and political life is a trained eye for the situation in which one has to act. And therefore, history is the only, historical understanding is the only way in which we can get clarity about what we have to do. Acting well means acting according to the situation. To a situation, especially to such situations where we do not have the help of rules, i.e., of universals. If ready-made rules for dealing with situations of specific types are what you want, natural science is the kind of thing which can provide you with them. He gives here an example of their general rules of no help. Everyone has certain rules according to which he acts in dealing with his tailor. These rules are, we will grant, soundly based on genuine experience. And by acting on them, a man will deal fairly with his tailor and help his tailor to deal fairly by him. But so far as he acts according to these rules, he is dealing with his tailor only in his capacity as a tailor, and not as John Robinson, age 60, with a weak heart and a consumptive daughter, a passion for gardening and overdraft at the bank. The rules for dealing with tailors no doubt enable you to cope with the tailor in John Robinson, but they prevent you from getting to grips with whatever else there may be in him. Of course, if you know that he has a weak heart, you will manage your dealings with him by modifying the rules for tailor situations in the light of the rules for situations involving people with weak hearts. But at this rate, the modifications soon become so complicated that the rules are no longer of any practical use to you. You have got beyond the stage at which rules can guide action, and you go back to improvising as best you can of a method of handling the situation in which you find yourself. Now, this is a key example, and therefore we have to look at it for one moment. Is it true that that only knowledge of the situation replaces a tailor by a complicated political situation? That knowledge of the situation as such, without any universals, can guide us. It may be true that all the rules are insufficient. Mr. Levy?
The example, I guess, would be Montgomery in general, or even maybe Churchill and the leaders. Does Montgomery have to know anything about Aristotle or about Ptolemy, and yet he had great practical wisdom as shown by his memoirs and scripture on that. Does Churchill have to know anything about Aristotle, which he seemed not to know very much about except for the ethics?
Yeah, but that is an entirely different question, whether rules means rules to be found in this or that book.
I was using it as an example of a rule, any rules, besides that of practical experience.
Yeah, but still, there was one thing, I believe, which was quite clear in the case of Montgomery, apart from the situation, or what constitutes the situation, namely that they had to win it, victory. Now, in the case of politics, as distinguished from generalship, the end is somewhat more complicated, complex, because the political good consists of a number of ingredients which cannot be reduced to the simple formula victory, and therefore there is all kind of consideration which of these ingredients is at the moment the most important or the most urgent. This is another point. But if you look at this case of the Taylor John Robinson, it is perfectly clear that it is a matter, first of all, of dealing fairly by him, and he should deal fairly by you. That universal fairness is essential for acting properly. And secondly, here, what modifies the rule, human kindness, which is not the same as fairness, also comes in. In other words, every situation demands of us that it be developed in one or the other direction. The question of the direction in which it should be developed is ultimately a question of universals, not necessarily universal rules, without which we could not act. And this question is simply lost in the historicism of Collingwood as well as in others. For Collingwood, as he makes clear, I give you one example, the question, what is the summum bonum, the highest good, is for him simply a pseudo-question. Or just as a question, what is knowledge, what is art? Because all questions must be understood situationally. I must say that in this respect, the ordinary positivistic social scientists, with their emphasis on the value questions, are preferable, in my opinion, to Collingwood. I mean, what speaks against them, I have tried to state. But in Collingwood, the question of the ends in their universality simply disappears with the concern for the situation in which you act. The question of the good life cannot be simply replaced by the question of what shall I do here, although the question of the good life becomes sterile if it is not specified by me in this situation in accordance with that situation. But perhaps Collingwood would say that the question of the good is a pseudo-question because it is already answered by the absolute presupposition of the society to which we belong, and therefore it cannot arise. But this is where we come up against the great question, what if the culture or society to which we belong is in a state of crisis and we lose our morals? This is not in any way faced by Collingwood. He ends the book with a discussion of the political situation at the time of the Spanish Civil War, and in which he takes a rather simplistic view of the situation. He takes it for granted that Neville Chamberlain was a crypto-fascist and other things which means he has the situation alone is a poor and insufficient guide for taking one's bearings both in private and in public matters. So I will leave it at these points, and I mean the understanding of the human product, thought or so, of the past. That's a common meaning. And why should this can be practiced on the basis of various philosophical assumptions. Historicism, no, is something much more specific. Historicism is the assertion that all human thought rests ultimately on presuppositions which differ from epoch to epoch and which are not susceptible of any criticism.
Oh, I see. Then Collingwood was concerned with both of these two things then.
Yeah, Collingwood comes entangled in this difficulty that while he has to assert the equality of all absolute presuppositions, he cannot help asserting the supremacy of that absolute presupposition which goes together with historicism. In other words, all other cultures or historical periods depended on such absolute presuppositions. Yeah? But his situation, the situation of his thought, goes together with an awareness of this fact. This is a radical change in the situation. That's the difficulty which existed from the very beginning. Mr. Shulsky?
Well, is it true, though, that this awareness of the historicity of thought is, in fact, a big change, especially when it comes to the actual writing of history, because it would seem that even if a modern historian is aware of historicism, he is just as culture-bound, so to speak, in writing history as anyone else was, so that this progress is, so to speak, external to the actual writing of history, or understanding of history.
That may be so, but still, let us assume that the historian is not affected by that, although it would be strange if the historicist insight did not have, if it is an insight, did not have an effect on the writing of history. But the key point is the philosophic question. Can historicism itself, must not historicism be applied to itself? That's to say, historicism too is historic. That's to say, belongs to a specific historical situation. This is not necessary. That is of course not in itself fatal, if it is properly thought through, provided the thinker in question implies that the situation to which the historicist insight belongs is a privileged moment. Let us say the absolute moment, the moment in which man becomes aware for the first time of the fundamental basis of all human thought and action. Of course, if he would have to make this intelligible, not the mere assertion wouldn't mean anything. He must show how come that this fundamental foundation of all foundations, which men never saw as such before, became visible in the 20th century. What is the peculiarity of the 20th century that it became visible here and now? That he must answer. Yes, Mr. Deborah.
As far as I understand, you agreed with Collingwood in saying that it was necessary today for a rapprochement between history and philosophy. Do you mean that in contrast to the pre-moderns, we simply have more obstacles to overcome, or did you mean something else more than that?
Well, I meant it in the first place as a strictly empirical assertion, in the old sense of the word. Where an empirical assertion means I know that it is so, and I do not know the reason. What they call a hard fact. A hard fact is a fact where you do not know the reason, because if you know the reason, it is no longer so hard. Yeah? And that is so that whenever I read something, an analysis of some fundamental concept with which political scientists are concerned, of course, the mere historical knowledge, if it is thoughtless and undigested, is of no value. I'm speaking only of the other case, the other way around. But if someone does not go into the genesis of these concepts, then he is simply a superficial analyst. One can state it formally and therefore very simply as follows. As men of science, we are all concerned with knowledge about the things of which we have primarily only opinions. And if we want to proceed in a perfectly above board and cleanly manner, we must first make clear to ourselves what our opinions are. We must clarify our opinions. Now, if we begin to do that, we see very soon that our opinions are only to a very small part, say, my opinions. They are to a very large part opinions which we share with our contemporaries, and even more, inherited opinions. But think of such a thing like political freedom. How much of it, well, there are some features perhaps which have emerged in the last generation, but fundamentally that is an inheritance. Now, if we want to clarify our opinion, we must therefore also go into this whole history of, quote, political liberty. Yeah? So the strictly philosophic concern with clarifying our opinions changes necessarily and even insensibly into historical study. This is, I think, an empirical fact which every one of us who is doing some thought, reflection about it, simply experiences. Now, when we look, say, at Aristotle, and we see he does not engage in such, in order to clarify his opinion, he does not engage into any kind of historical studies. Yeah? And with disregarding all differences of rank between people like ourselves and Aristotle entirely, because even the greatest men now living would have to engage in it, in historical studies, whereas Aristotle did not. Then the first impression one gets, and this is supported by powerful prejudice, that Aristotle, however great he was, lacked the awareness of a certain dimension, of the historical dimension, and which awareness is a preserve of the 19th and 20th century, somehow prepared by people like Vico and, the usual litany you get. Then that is a question. I mean, it should be a question at least. Is this interpretation correct? Is the acquisition of that sixth sense, the historical sense, enrichment of man's understanding, or a corrective to peculiar defects of modern thought? That's a question. And I think wherever we will come, however we will answer it, I think we are wiser if we have raised that question and not simply accepted the view now prevailing. Because if we accept the view now prevailing, we simply accept the prejudice. Now, prejudice may be true, but if I realize that it is true, it is no longer prejudice. Accepting prejudice is as such a questionable thing, for academic people at least. Yes.
Does one, must one continue? You say that in order to investigate our opinions, we must go into the origins and so on. Does one ever get to the end of this? Do you ever, or are you constantly in this historical investigation?
Yeah, well, that is a very difficult question. I mean, we must be, we ourselves, and we must never lose a certain common sense. Yeah? In other words, for a given purpose, it may be perfectly sufficient to stop at a certain point, and it may be relatively easy. But other questions are really very dark. I could tell you some stories from my private experience where I was sure I had clarified something or concept of which I thought was relatively important, and then I found that further studies are still indicated. But it all depends what the immediate purpose of the study is, and if one is proved, that is exactly the point with which we are confronted when we advise students regarding doctor's thesis. Let us assume that the subject is interesting, is of interest. And then the question arises, is it manageable? Now, what is true of students is true in a modified manner also of professors, and even of old professors, who are supposed to be able to manage problems which a doctoral candidate cannot manage. But even they, and precisely they, will also come across questions which cannot be managed, and therefore they have to find some defensible and not arbitrary division of the subject matter so that they can do that. Whether a full clarification is in fact possible, that is a very long question. And to the extent to which historicism means only this, that a full clarification is not possible, to that extent it got a point. But the question is whether one has to be a historicist in order to admit the infinity and the elusiveness of the truth. I mean, this is, do you see how this is implied? Yes.
If I understand what you said about Collingwood correctly, you would say that you can't say whether Plato or Hobbes, for example, which one of these was right, because each one asks an essentially different question.
Yes.
Then you said, but you can still, in contradistinction, you can still ask which question is higher or more worthy.
Yeah.
Wouldn't Collins would say, this doesn't make any sense because the worth of a particular question is only relative to the particular age in which it was asked.
Yeah, but then Collingwood goes on to say that there is something more fundamental than all questions. Yeah? What he calls the absolute presuppositions, on the basis of which questions arise. And he says these absolute presuppositions, regarding them you cannot say whether the absolute presupposition of Plato or that of Hobbes is true or not. It seems simple enough. But then he discusses the question of modern physics, 17th century and so on, which is based on specific absolute presuppositions. But here we see the very strange fact that modern science represents a progress beyond earlier science insofar as it can solve all kinds of questions which were insoluble in the past. Or nearer home, the most fundamental insight possible on the basis of Collingwood is the insight into the historical character of all thought. The insight that all human thought is based on absolute presuppositions. I would say this is the absolute presupposition of absolute presuppositions. It is an incomparable, as the absolute presuppositions of the first order cannot be said to be true or false, according to Collingwood. The absolute presupposition of absolute presuppositions is true. And I mean, what do you care about the absolute presuppositions of the first order if you have a much more fundamental insight of which you can be sure that it is true. Yeah? Do you see that point? I think the position, as Collingwood stated it, is not tenable. It was developed much more subtly and profoundly on the basis of Nietzsche by Heidegger, of which I spoke last time. And here the difficulties also appear in a peculiar way. Well, I would like to mention only one point. Fundamentally, this what Collingwood says about absolute presuppositions would be accepted by Heidegger. But there is Heidegger only states it differently, and Heidegger is much more concerned with the connection between thought and language. A language is, of course, always a language of this or that people, with this and that peculiar tradition. Therefore, when we think traditionally of truth, we mean the universality of truth. Well, as you say today in mathematics, this is a universal language. Yeah? But philosophy can, of course, never take on this mathematical character. It is always linked to a specific language, whether it is German or Greek or English, and so on and so on. Necessarily particular. Now, today we are for the first time, all inhabitants of this globe are brought into contact with another. And the question of the universalism of thought, with which the philosophers were always concerned as the scientists, has now become a grave practical problem. You know? Now, therefore, I would like to state it as simply as possible. It's a very complex thing. In brief, what Heidegger is trying to do, Heidegger links up the historicist insight with an insight into the essential defect of all previous philosophy, of all philosophy of Greek origin. There was fundamentally something narrow about the traditional view which implied that history is philosophically irrelevant. Now, this enlargement is somehow connected in Heidegger's view with the need today to start an intellectual meeting with the Far East. I mean, not Mao, but with the Chinese tradition on what is there. And of course not with those people who run around in America and say what Confucius say is what Thomas Jefferson say. And not these, but the people who really understand that tradition and know that this is nonsense. And now that a dialogue between Westerners of great depth and thoughtfulness with Easterners of the same character could contribute to enlarge, to free the West from its peculiar defects. And on a very low level, that is suggested by Northrop, of whom many of them, but there is no comparison between them. I must emphasize that. And now, here's the interesting point. Here you could say that you reach here at the end a truly universal understanding, where Westerners and Easterners see the same thing in the same manner. But here's the point. The difference in the dialogue between the Westerner and the Easterner, there is an understanding. They understand each other. But in a way they remain, of course, the same. Each is enlarged. The Westerner is enlarged by the Easterner. The Easterner is enlarged by the Westerner. But the starting point, that the one is the Westerner, the one is the Easterner, is remain. In other words, the universal regarding which they agree still looks different from the two different points of view. Do you see that? That is, I think, that is the most extreme attempt of which I'm aware of trying to reconcile historicism with this universalism, which is without which human thought is not possible. Yes.
it's true that Hobbes' state and Plato's state would not be the same thing. Yet it seems as though they had contradictory notions, not only what the state was, but what human nature is. And those surely were not, human nature was not fundamentally different necessarily, but their understanding was
that's the point.
And how would Collingwood get around that or explain that problem? I mean, is man fundamentally, does he fundamentally seek his own self-preservation?
No, but that is much too superficial from Collingwood's point of view. Man is a being which is essentially historical. Man has always, as he puts it, a determinate nature. You don't find man nude, so to speak. Man without having interpreted himself and the world. Proof, language. On every stage of which we find man, he has a language, and this language means a complete interpretation on whichever level of human life and the whole. And behind that you cannot go, you know. You cannot speak of human nature, what you can never, the naked human nature, so to speak, you can never find. You can never find. That is radically inaccessible. And therefore all general science of men like biology or psychology would remain below the level of this whole problem, because the argument would be that biology and psychology always rest themselves on premises which they cannot substantiate and which are somehow dependent on what Collingwood calls the absolute presuppositions, regarding which the question of truth and untruth cannot be raised. Yes, Mr. Branke.
As I understand how you state Heidegger's attempt, that would seem to me to be only of practical and not of philosophical relevance, unless you conceive of that reconciliation or enlargement between the East and the West at the absolute moment that becomes the whole, what has been missing in either tradition.
No, it is of course of theoretical importance, because the Westerners learn something which they do not know from their own tradition. Just as the Easterners learn something in their dialogue which they do not know from their tradition. And so to say, the sentences which Heidegger has devoted to this subject go easily on a single page. He only alludes to that, but I believe that is very important for the horizon in which he thinks. The key point is, under no conditions, a return to past ways of thinking. That's reactionary, you know. That is so in Heidegger as well as in people much lower than he is. And he sees this in former times, the view, sometimes people have the view, very common in the West, there is a Greek way of thinking which is deficient and must be supplemented by the biblical way of thinking, which is also in a way East. Palestine being situated in Asia. But this is out for Heidegger. I mean, in this respect, he simply follows Nietzsche. Christianity is not acceptable to him in any way. And he seeks for this supplement to the West, not even in India, but in the Far East. No reasons, only allusions to this thing are given. But I think what interested me only was this peculiar universalism. Yeah? I mean, on the level of positivism, universalism is no problem. Proof, Chinese who are biologists, mathematicians, and so on, as any Westerner. Truth is, science is essentially universal. But this becomes a problem when one reflects about the fact that modern science, while being accessible to every human being of certain gifts, is of Western origin and somehow dependent on absolute presuppositions of Western origin. I mean, the thing which the people bring out about Parisian nominalism and other things as a basis of modern science. There are lots of things which a certain rightly or wrong. And therefore this will not do. I mean, or this understanding of engineers all over the globe. This doesn't go to the fundamental human questions. And here there is where the suggestion comes in that you can, nor is it possible, according to this kind of people, that such a thing like universal there is a universal morality. Because if you look at the moralities, in a crude way, they might agree you have to behave decently and in a more or less gentlemanly manner, and so they agree on the whole. But when you come to at more subtle questions, more detailed questions, say monogamy and so on, you get a great variety of answers, and this leads ultimately leads first to the doubt of any possible universal morality, and yet ultimately the need for, and not only the practical, but in the first place the theoretical need of universalism asserts itself very simply. The historicist thesis is a universal thesis. No one can run away from that. And the simple, colloquially one say we cannot run away from reason. And the simple proof is we cannot run away from making, in the end, universal assertion. And even if we supply them with some question marks, and so that doesn't affect it fundamentally. Now I will leave it at that, and would like to say how I plan to go on. After having considered positivism and historicism, the two prevailing ways of thinking in the West today, and furthermore the fact that both are incompatible with political philosophy, the idea of political philosophy, I have to raise the question whether there is not some common ground between political philosophy and the views now prevailing. And the answer is there is one. It is the history of political philosophy. This is not denied by any serious man, that the history of political philosophy is possible and necessary. However, impossible political philosophy itself may be. And we will start on this basis, on an ironic basis, and forget about all polemics. So.